Hello. Perhaps you've heard of the legend of the black-eyed children. Perhaps you haven't. No, this is not a video about beating children until they have black eyes. Oh, no, 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 no. This is, they're much more terrifying than that. So let's jump right into this. I have a little bit of background and 9 stories to tell you about encounters from these kids. So imagine it, you're at home, and you get a knock on your door. You get an innocent sounding request from a child. They want to be let in. Now, these guys have only been a staple of paranormal legends since the early 90s. Some believe the first entered the public consciousness after about 1998. But 20 years later, these mysterious black eyed kids have been found in many creepypastas postings. But what or who are these black eyed children? Oh, typically these kids range from early adolescence to late teens and appeal to adult sympathy. They'll appear on the side of the road, a front doorstep, all asking for help. Some people believe these children are extraterrestrials or vampires. Others think they're demons. But you know what? If you see a kid with jet black eyes, run. Just run. So let's jump into these stories. First one, in January of 2016, a woman in Vermont made the mistake of letting 2 of these kids into her home. A blizzard was raging outside, and she heard a knocking at her door. A boy and a girl stood there, and they were cold, they were shivering, just begging to use her phone. She was kind of put off by their presence, but the woman let them in anyways and went to get her phone. And after the kids walked into the light of her family room, the woman realized that their eyes were completely black. And she stared at them in terror, and her husband's nose just started bleeding at the same time that the power went out. And after what felt like forever, the kids spoke up at the same time, saying that their parents had arrived. The woman watched as the 2 left her house and entered a black car that had a man wearing a suit. Not long after this encounter, the woman's husband was diagnosed with severe skin cancer, and the woman started suffering from regular nosebleeds and an onslaught of other medical issues. And she's convinced that her failing health, along with her husband's, is the result of the black eyed children that she unknowingly let into her home. In 2010, a man known as, we'll just call him Jim, he encountered 2 of the black eyed teenagers outside of his workplace. Oh, this was in July in Ohio, and he was in the middle of a night shift. He went out on a smoke break, stepped outside the building, noticed the 2 teenage boys across the street. As he smoked a cigarette, he realized that the boys were staring at him. Oh, he returned to the safety of his cubicle and tried to refocus on his work, only to see through the security cameras that the boys had appeared in front of the building and they were motioning for him to come outside. And he got sick of it. He went to the door and he was thinking whether or not he should call the police. And as if they had read his minds, the boys insisted that such an action was unnecessary. All they needed was to use a phone. He watched in horror as one of the boys continued to stare up at the security camera while the other boy went to the back of the building, watching the cameras as though they could see what Jim was doing. Now, with his nerves just shot now, he contacted the police, watching the teenagers on the video feed the whole time. When the officer arrived on the scene, he couldn't locate any kids anywhere, despite the fact that Jim never tore his eyes from the video feed. On March 17th, 2008, a 12-year-old boy had a chilling experience in a mall parking lot. He was waiting in his mother's truck for his mother to finish getting her haircut, and he saw this boy walking across a parking lot. He thought it was a friend of his from school, so he banged on the window until the other boy turned around. Now, realizing it wasn't his friend, the boy in the truck watched in confusion as this strange kid walked up and stared at him through the window. The boy caught a glance at the other boy's solid black eyes and knew he was just staring into the face of pure, unadulterated evil. The little boy was like, "You must let me in." And the black-eyed boy demanded and demanded and demanded that the 12-year-old boy let him in the truck. Now, this boy panicked. He was in the car, crouched underneath the glove compartment, hiding. After several minutes, the black-eyed boy finally disappeared. And when the boy's mother returned to the truck, she told her son that the black-eyed kid had come into the salon demanding the keys to her vehicle. She, of course, didn't give them to him, but can you imagine if she did? Oh, fuck that. One night, a man was dozing off in his spare bedroom, in his in his spare bedroom with his infant daughter, and he heard a strange bump outside his house. At first, the man thought nothing of it. He thought it might be the family cat or a raccoon or something, but the thumps continued. The guy checked the porch, but the cat was nowhere to be found. And then he walked into his kitchen and found two figures loitering outside his front door, and they knocked on the door. Both are boys, around 10 or 11, and they just gave off this horrible smell like rotting flesh and mold. And he asked if they could use his phone. Now, they were looking up at the guy, and to his horror, the man realized that both boys had eyes that were completely black. The man told the boys he didn't have service in his house, and he shut the door. And the guy slowly made his way back to his daughter's room. The two boys slumped on the walls. The man clutched his daughter to his chest as the boys just kept knocking against the window, knocking, knocking, knocking. And their eerie eyes and awful persistence made the man too scared to fall asleep. And he remained crouched on the floor of the room for several hours. He was fighting just to ignore those knocks that happened every couple minutes. And the second his wife's alarm clock went off, the knocking ceased and the black-eyed children were nowhere to be seen. One October day, a man was walking up to his front door and he realized that his neighbor hadn't set out his typical array of Halloween decorations. He found his neighbor, asked him about it, and the neighbor informed him of a terrifying experience that had happened to him the year before. And it kept him from even wanting to participate in Halloween that year. He said it was around midnight when he heard a knock at the door. He thought it was a band of late-night trick-or-treaters, so he grabbed his bowl of candy and walked to his door. He swung the door open, was about to greet the two male teens, when he just became stiff with fear. He petrified, could not move. Both boys had pitch black eyes. They just didn't have any white in them at all, just black. And one of the boys asked to come in and use the phone. And luckily, this guy was so scared and had just this feeling of dread that he refused. One evening, a recluse living in British Columbia, he decided to go see a scary movie at his local theater. And he was already, up on edge and anxious because of the movie. He leapt from his chair when he heard a knock on his door later that night. With each step he took towards the door, he just felt like this overwhelming sense of dread come over him, just running up and down his spine. But he went through it, and something compelled him to open the door. Standing on the front porch was a beautiful teenage girl. Now this guy, I guess she was about 6 feet tall, had beautiful blonde hair, and asked, "May I enter?" And she looked up at the man with solid black eyes. He was terrified by what he saw, and the man screamed and slammed the door in her face. And he marched off to his bedroom, pulled out a gun, and sat in a chair in the corner until morning. Now, several hours later, when he went to retrieve his mail, the black-eyed teen was nowhere to be found, but the word "soon" was etched into his front door. On November 19th, 1992, this guy was watching Evil Dead while his wife and kids were sound asleep upstairs in their rooms. It was about 1:30 in the morning when he decided to head to bed after the movie was over. And suddenly there was a loud pounding on his door, and what stood behind the door would change him, like, forever. There was a boy and a girl about 8 and 11 years old who never looked up. They were standing barefoot and it was middle of Michigan, winter. Despite his anger, the man allowed the children to enter and allow them to phone their parents. But when he went to lend them the phone, they were gone. It was dead silent, and then he heard the first scream coming from one of the upstairs bedrooms. When the man reached his wife's room, he saw the most devastating sight of his life. His wife was in a pool of blood and terrifying sounds of bone snapping and flesh ripping, and he saw the bare feet of the children he had just let into his home. But before he could act, the bare feet children moved swiftly to his kid's room and locked the door. Now, this guy was pounding and trying so hard, but despite his best efforts, he couldn't help his children. He had to stand helpless behind the door. And when the act was done, the door slowly creaked open, and there were the barefoot children covered in blood, and they just stood defiantly, just grinning evilly, and eyes completely black. In early November 2012, a woman was up late watching a movie with her cat when it suddenly leapt off her lap. The woman was, kind of stunned, and she followed her cat to the laundry room, but the cat refused to leave from its spot between the machines. And then the woman heard knocks on her door and figured it was late-night trick-or-treaters. When she opened the door, the woman was met by two children, a boy and a girl. However, there was something really off about these kids. They just stood there looking into her house. They weren't wearing costumes or holding any of their buckets, but why would they? Because it's frickin' November. A boy suddenly asked the woman if her cat had left, which kind of caused some concern in the woman. Then the girl whispered to the boy, "We need to get inside." And the boy was just staring at her, grinning. And she was terrified, and she noticed that their eyes were completely black, and the woman just shut the door and called the police. When the police got there, they only found footprints that led into the house behind the woman's home, and it wasn't until months later that the woman had found a makeshift bed in her gardening shed. On Thanksgiving 2015 in suburban America, a woman was enjoying the holidays in her own house, and she heard a knock. It was around 7:30 p.m., and she heard the knock on the door, and she thought it was her neighbors. So she opened the door without looking. However, there stood two boys outside her door, and they were standing there in kind of a weird stance. They avoided any eye contact, but kept insisting to enter her house. The woman became hesitant, which is when the older of the two boys became more persistent. This is where they finally looked up, and the woman noticed they had completely black eyes. She shut the door on them, but they kept knocking and knocking and knocking. And eventually, she fell asleep during the early morning with all the lights on the TV playing. Same girl, that's how I'd be. But when she woke up, all the lights were turned off, and the TV was just static. And there had been someone or something inside her house. Oh, I don't know about any of you, but if I ever see these kids, man, I think that would fuck me up. This these little suckers are terrifying, and I would not want to meet them anywhere. I know it's not really a Vermont tale, but they have been seen in Vermont, according to stories. So if you hear a knock on your door, just might be the black-eyed children. So I do have more folklore, legends, myths, and some true stuff coming up as well. Go ahead, like, and subscribe for more, and have a wonderful day. Bye.